Edna has water, which is good. I have some water.
Always. By this time of the day, I have no voice usually.
I know. This morning I woke up and my voice wasn't functioning, and I was thinking, oh, this is the perfect start. That's great.
So it looks like we're on air now, Henna, but we're just waiting for the audience to turn up.
Yes.
There they are.
I wanted to make sure it was 12 o'clock before we started, just because of the timing was officially 12. Let's start, shall we? Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome to colleagues, friends, fellow members of the community. Today is Global Day of Encryption, which is about bringing awareness and thought leadership on many factors, but risks and issues, opportunities and solutions regarding the internet, and really the future, well, regarding encryption, but really the future of the internet. And so today our conversation is alongside several key panelists. I'm greatly impressed by these colleagues here, and I'll do my best to introduce them very quickly and then pass it over to them to really give us a few things about them. So on our panel, we have Gentry Lane, we have Heather Dahl, Edna Conway, and Colin Constable. And I would love if for a minute, if all of you could just take a moment to give us a 30-second window around maybe your title, a quick moment of background, and I would love if you had a superpower to share with us and the audience today, if you could sort of give us a view of that as well. I'll start with you, Gentry.
Great. Hi, hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me with this August panel. My name is Gentry Lane. I'm the CEO and founder of Anova Intelligence. We're a defense tech company that leverages AI and deep learning to protect critical companies from cyber aggression. I'm also a fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute at GMU, and I work with NATO on cyber conflict strategy. My superpower is killer math. Math is the weapon of choice in cyber conflict, and it's, Henna, AI is not as mysterious as most people think. It's just math. So I like to think of myself as a math murderer, killing malicious cyber actors on a binary battlefield. And in my head, I am totally wearing a cape.
That's awesome. Only the bad guys. Only the bad guys.
Oh yeah.
Heather, over to you.
I'm Heather Dahl. Thank you for having us here today. I'm CEO of Indicio Tech. We develop and build trusted data ecosystems for the high value exchange of information and data. We focus on healthcare, financial services, and travel industries. My superpower aligns to the career I had before entering technology, and that was as a broadcast journalist. And so I'm very good at distilling complex and complicated stories into ways that people can understand, no matter their technical ability, and learn how it can impact their daily lives.
And Heather, you have a really courageous background on the board of the National Press Foundation as well, which is an incredible background behind the scenes of what you do today.
Yes, I serve on the board of the National Press Foundation, and we provide education and development for journalists around the world, as well as supporting freedom of press in the US, the First Amendment issues. And so I think being exposed to the challenges that journalists face today in conducting their jobs, in sourcing reports and materials, and also in publication helps shine a light on what we're doing here in the space of encryption.
Thank you, Heather. Edna, very nice to see you. Always great to see you. Over to you for some intro.
Thank you so much. It's certainly my privilege to be here with all of you. Although I have to say, anybody who says they're a murderer triggers the fact that early in my career, I was a homicide prosecutor. So bad choice of words, I guess. So I have the privilege of actually serving as the Chief Security and Risk Officer for Microsoft's intelligent cloud platform, Azure. And my superpower is actually the ability to inject humor into any situation, usually served with a little bit of homemade lasagna.
I've heard about this lasagna a few times. I can't wait to learn a little bit more how to cook. My cooking skills are not that great. Colin, over to you.
Hey everyone, super pleased to be here with you all. So I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders of the ACT company. We are working to give everybody end-to-end encrypted everything, and allowing people to actually own their own data and actually manage their own data, but without pain. And so we're creating an SDK and a platform for our developers to make brand new experiences on the internet. So I'm an internet optimist. When we started with the internet, and I'm pretty old, so I was sort of one of the early people that was playing on the internet, and it was a lot of fun. It's less fun these days, and I want to bring the fun back to the internet. And I think we can do that through end-to-end encryption and letting people understand that all this stuff is not as complicated as they think it is, and not to be intimidated. It's not that intimidating once you get your head around some of the basics. My superpower, and I think as the CTO of at the ad company, I think everybody at the ad company knows what my superpower is. I can find bugs in pretty much anything, normally by accident. So over the last couple of years, we found, I found bugs or been tripped up by bugs that have been over 20 years old that have been out there, and yet I had to trip over them. So most famously, double unicorn. So if you put a double unicorn in a Unicode transform, it didn't work. And I was the first person in 20 years to find that, because that was the first thing I typed in was 2 unicorns. Why wouldn't you? So yeah, that's consistently my superpower, finding unbelievably ridiculously bugs.
That's awesome. That's the kind of background we need for encryption when we think
Yeah,
about
for sure.
make sure we resolve this. I know today is going to be an incredible day. We have a few topics to discuss. The hour is going to go by so fast with your backgrounds. And just to recap on the panel, we have Gentry, who's a math conqueror and who's got such a great global sense of countries and nationalities and all the things that are happening at the global level. We've got Heather, who's got huge background on trusted data ecosystems, encrypted communication, and board of the National Press Foundation. We've got Edna, who is thinking holistically about the enterprise technology, who lives and breathes all this stuff every day and is bringing together encryption, but security, compliance, privacy, all of that under one roof. And then, of course, Colin, who's got the peer-to-peer tech and can completely find every bug in every line of code possible. So this is a wonderful panel. Let me start really quickly with you, Heather, if that's okay with you. As a pioneer in this space, someone that's been through sort of a versions, many variations of thought here, both on the ground level, both now as a CEO of an organization. Let's start with the human being. Let's start with the people. What's important about encryption now? And what kind of, if you look past the last 3 years, how has the last 3 years sort of evolved to today?
What makes me excited about the past 3 years is we have seen the evolution around the development in encryption in the open source communities, specifically for the use of decentralized identity for people. And one particular project that I point to is Hyperledger Ursa. And that project is specifically focused on building the libraries that are then used with the supporting Hyperledger projects Aries and Indy. When you combine Ursa, the encryption, with Aries, which provides the agents and the tools and the software, and then you have Indy, which is a decentralized ledger, you have the ability for humans, for individuals, to hold secure encrypted credentials containing information about themselves and share it with consent securely to another party. And the entire ecosystem and the process of obtaining information about yourself, holding it, and then sharing it, not only does have consent built in, it is completely encrypted from end to end. And that project is also moved and advanced peer-to-peer communication encryption. And so what I love about it in the last 3 years is you see this open source community and these communities coming together to advance encryption to, as a mission, a cause, and their goals.
You're on mute, Henna.
On mute.
I was trying to make sure there was no background noise as Heather spoke. Thank you for that. So Heather, that's really good. So the last couple of years, we have seen huge open source communities, and only more and more will occur, right? And a variety of thinking. And it's actually a great progress in just human connections and conversations. And with that sort of lens, looking backward and sort of being where we are now and thinking about built-in consent. That's such a strong word, right? Built-in consent. What are your thoughts, Colin, with regards to keeping the human at the center, looking 3 years forward from now? What should be the case? What should we want to, what's the good, better, and best from that point of view?
So I think when the internet started, everyone was very worried about using the internet for stuff. So there was a bunch of academics or a bunch of military people that were using the internet to get things from point A to point B, and that was fun. And then consumers started using the internet, and we were all worried about using the internet. And frankly, encryption came to the rescue. That little padlock in your browser that was then SSL is now TLS, but nobody cares. You've got that little padlock on the top right-hand corner, and now left, actually. But what that meant was you knew that data between your browser and the server somewhere on the internet was encrypted, and that gave a sense of trust that you actually knew who you were speaking to, and you could do online banking, you could do e-commerce. And obviously the internet exploded through 2000 and then sort of recessed a little bit. But now I think commerce is happening on the internet. That's great. The downside of that, I think, was that only servers have SSL certificates. So you can only speak to a server, and that put power in whoever's running the server, because they get to see all the data in the clear, because that's the way it works. So the way the internet works at the moment is individuals can speak to a server, the server sees everything in the clear, they can grab whatever they want to grab, try and manipulate you if they want to manipulate you, and influence you because they have everything in the clear. So I don't want that to continue. That's nasty. But what if everybody actually had their own microserver, and everyone had their own certificate, and everyone had their own identity on the internet, and it was really easy. So that's what we're working on, and I really believe that that's a game-changing idea. I've spoken to a bunch of industry luminaries, and they've been thinking about this for 30 plus years, but really only now is the technology available to actually make this happen. And the big changes are, number one, mobile devices are really, really powerful now, and they can create cryptographic keys. So you can actually cut your own cryptographic keys, your keys, not anybody else's keys, not somebody's server's keys. You can actually count your cryptographic keys on your mobile device, and that means you're in control. And I think that's a game changer. Just like SSL was on the internet, was a game changer. Actually cutting your own keys on the internet and you gaining control means that you can then talk to people, entities, devices, and know that they are them and you are you, and you can have a secure connection between people, entities, and things. What gives rise out of that is a whole bunch of confidence. So we couldn't predict what the internet was going to be in 1993, when I started playing with some of this stuff. I could not have predicted what was going to happen. Actually, I think famously other people could, but I certainly couldn't see it. And I don't think this small little change of actually having everybody having their own certificate and their own point of presence and their own identity on the internet is a game changer for a whole bunch of use cases we can't think of. One of the biggest ones, and I come from sort of large enterprise. Wall Street, used to work on Wall Street, used to work in the insurance industry, and we're all chasing down data. And it drives me crazy that everybody's got a copy of my data. One of the other co-founders of the ad company moved house just a few weeks ago. I think he has over 400 databases to update. Why is it his job to update all those databases? And I know Henna in the past, I know you've had to run one of these databases trying to keep all these databases up to date. The internet needs to be flipped upside down. I should be able to update my information on my database, and the internet should ask me. And if I trust it, whoever the other party is, then they can have the new data. Then everything's up to date. I don't have to. So there's less pain. The internet's more fun again. So over the next 3 years, I think more and more people will sort of realize that that's the way it should be. We designed the internet wrong, and that's fine. But we're going to get over it, and it's going to be a fun place again. So long answer to a very short question. Sorry, Henna.
No, it's great. In fact, I think I did the mistake once of talking to somebody and saying, I wonder if the internet had an architecture when it was designed, and the answer was, of course it did. Of course it did. And I was like, well, evolving times, and given that now we use the internet for things that we perhaps didn't realize at the time, maybe we should really think about this again. And it brings me right to you, Edna, when you think about this breadth of topics and yes, people, entities, and things, and how they sort of that tripod interact. And the concept of encryption is maybe it's a tool, maybe it's more of a perspective, maybe it's a way of setting up things together. But this idea of architecture and how to optimize it for encryption, for security, for privacy. Some of these factors, and I know you and I have spoken about this in the past on what's encryption when it's in use, in storage, in transit. Any thoughts there would be wonderful.
Yeah, so, intriguing concepts thus far. I think you hear a theme emerging, and none of us prepped together. So the reality is, I always like to remind people that technology exists to serve us, the humans, not the other way around. And some days when you're fighting with your technology, quite frankly, it feels like you're in service of it rather than the way it should be. But if you start to think about encryption, if you will, as a tool in our innovation toolkit, right? So how can we use it more strategically rather than after the fact? What if you start to build an architecture that says, what am I trying to do? So for me, it's pretty clear. I have an architecture that's built on two fundamental pillars, security and resiliency. Security includes physical security, logical operational security, behavioral security, information security, IP protection, and privacy. So I know where I want to go and what I want to protect. And when you think about everything I just talked about, at the end of the day, it's in service of the human. And then you move over to resiliency and you think about things like anti-bribery and anti-corruption and just plain old-fashioned business continuity and disaster recovery. We're all sitting here still dealing with a global pandemic, the likes of which we've not seen before. I could keep going, even things like export and trade control. So you have that architecture. And everybody's like, well, what in God's name does that have to do with encryption? But encryption is actually a tool in my innovation toolkit, right? So what level of encryption? How should I flexibly apply it? And you could say all encryption everywhere all the time. Brilliant. But being able to access the data in an emergency, do you need everything everywhere all the time? Rather, could you apply the tool in a fashion that allows you the right level of encryption at the right time, in the right place, in the right manner, and give the power back to the human to whom ultimately the data applies and belongs, and ownership is important here. So if you start to think about things like, so I have the privilege of sitting on about 5 or 6 boards and also working with the US government on a number of task forces. And I think we have something in common. I also work with NATO. When you think about how we actually deploy it as a tool, what you start to do is you look at where are different types of attackers attacking and what do they want, right? I'd like to challenge all of us to start to think about encryption as a capability. And I'm going to give you a crazy area that it might apply, but it goes to this sort of empowerment of what we can do with our talent and ourselves. So we all know there are export and trade controls, and they vary country by country. They limit very significantly what you can do in the development of certain types of technology, the classification of that technology, where you can sell it, and who can work on it. And there's this concept called the deemed export. And you can say, what in heaven's name does that have to do with encryption? Okay, so think about this with me. I have a dream in the future that we could get to a place where we could push lobbyists to get to the right legislators and regulators to say, No longer do I have to start to worry about someone's national origin who's working on technology, because there are concerns about who works on what and where it can then be exported to, or who will buy it. Rather, what I can do is deploy, let me say it, post-quantum level encryption in the right way, so that we now can deploy the power of the talent regardless of national origin, regardless of where they sit and operate, and not have a deemed export. That's using encryption for the future as a power of innovation and good to extrapolate development, new technology, and innovation.
That's really incredible, actually. You brought it home with the human side of all of these things. And one of the key words you mentioned was flexibility, Edna, which doesn't always go hand in hand with encryption. So it's wonderful to see that. And let's bring it home with this breadth of concepts. Gentry, let's talk about the community, the country,
Yes.
and from a national lens. What are one or two critical things you see from encryption, security, and so on?
No, this is great. This is such a great conversation. And yeah, Edna, you set it up perfectly. The right to security and reasonable privacy is a non-negotiable essential pillar of democracy. And any loss or erosion of this reasonable privacy is a dangerous, dangerous step in the direction of authoritarianism. I'm so glad that we're invoking NATO, because this right to privacy is not just a nice to have, it's a must have if you value democratic freedoms. And the difficulty lies in balancing privacy versus the very real need for defense, because authorities need to see where the bad guys are and what they're doing in order to protect you. But the problem is the bad guys are in your most intimate space. They're in your computer. So on one hand, we absolutely do not want state surveillance. On the other hand, how is our government going to protect us from other governments who want to steal your private data, financial data, or intellectual property? And nobody wants the FBI or Department of Defense in their computer. But this is a great conundrum and great thing to discuss, is how can we expect them to defend us against something that they can't see?
And if I was to dig a little bit deeper on that, Gentry, it's a very interesting concept these are really fabulous points of views. When we think about intimate space and the computer, I haven't heard that before. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit about that, and maybe the thought around surveillance, the lack of data, protection, the concept of free democracy? These factors are almost confusion when we think about the surveillance and privacy conversations.
Yeah, it actually happened when I had a meeting with an FBI friend, and we're trying to figure out, because the FBI headquarters is like closed, COVID, you don't want to. So I had them over to my house, and you're thinking, God, you don't want the FBI in your house. But really, it's fine to have them in your house, but not to have them looking at your computer. So it's like our own private space. Our most intimate space now is our computer, not necessarily our actual physical homes. I mean, that's where all the secret stuff is, and that's where you live a second life. You live your computer is your virtual representation of your whole world. I mean, everything about you is on there. So,
and interestingly, we may not even know when they're there. At our home, perhaps we may know. And maybe we can actually ask them to leave if needed. But when it's in a computer, such situation, it's quite hard to do that.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I know everybody has this weird idea that the government is watching you, the government is spying on you. No. It would be great if there was better, what we call situational awareness, because there would be no cybercrime, there would be no nation-state cyber aggression if we were able to see where the bad guys are. But that is not the case.
That's a great question. So, delving a little deeper into this, not just surveillance, but encryption and privacy, maybe even to a certain extent. Edna, if I pass it over to you for a moment, when we think about this concept of encryption, let's talk about it in context, because what does it actually mean? And how do we get security to connect with this concept of encryption in real time? And you probably deal with this all the time with regards to disaster recovery, business continuity, and so many other factors of the quantum encryption concept. And I know you and I talked a little bit about storage on glass. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, again, use it as a tool, and when do you use it, right? And we could all look at each other and say, we think end-to-end encryption all the time, everywhere is the perfect solution. But sometimes it isn't. And if you start to think about using it in a surgical way, as opposed to a peanut butter approach, all of a sudden that helps us. And I think it helps us, and I'll give you another example. So I have the privilege of sitting on the board of a company that's using nanotechnology to create unclonable diamond dust as a fingerprint for microelectronics. And if you think about that, it's really cool, but the question then becomes, fabulous. I know it's unclonable, but I need a reader, I need a scanner, I need to identify it. All of a sudden, everything becomes real, right? So, I mean, it's sort of like everybody who, if you ever look at any of the social media, I love all the security people who decide not to put their picture on. And it's sort of, at some point you want to scratch your head and say, thank you for thinking that you're being secret. I can figure out what the hell you look like in about 15 seconds. But I'm glad it makes you feel better. What you really want to do is you really want to start actually thinking about, where do I want to protect that data and how am I going to use it? And now encryption becomes this powerful tool that you can leverage, not just in the identity circumstances and the privacy that we're talking about, because let's be clear, we want it there. We own this. I own who I am, as does everybody else on this wonderful planet we live on, and we're all committed to achieving that. However, when you start to move it in, Henna, to the operational level, as we've discussed, you need to remember it's a tool in your toolkit. A lot of people forget about it, right? And Heather, it might have been you, Gentry, forgive me, I can't recall which of the two of you were talking about distributed ledgers, right? It was sort of when people started first talking about blockchain, and you wanted to scratch your head yet again and say, yes, we've had them for quite some time. They were called distributed ledger, but blockchain apparently sounds sexier. Got it. But it's a tool that we can use, and you can embed encryption. So I think you start to even think about it in worlds where you're using technology with sensors and accessing information. You walk down, let's pick HoloLens, it's near and dear to my heart, or any other device that allows you to see real-time sensor information in a factory floor. Anybody thinking about encryption there? Well, you ought to be, right, as a tool. And so this is the power of bringing the future of encryption into every aspect of our own individual lives and our enterprise level operations.
And if we take a little bit further, so you mentioned, Edna, something really, I think is kind of deep in how are we, it's not about just getting the information and encrypting it. It's about how are we going to use it, so that knowing how we're going to use it actually then sort of derives backwards, perhaps, what we protect and how we protect it. And maybe a little bit about that you're sharing. And I'll maybe pass it over to you, Colin, to think a little bit deeper on this one, this idea of how we're going to exchange information. What's the purpose of it? What's the action items we're taking out of that? And this idea of these network companies, right? They're the evolution of network companies that have happened so far. We're really shifting from problem to people and the need of this idea of encryption, and then maybe even this concept that we've talked about previously around trusted triangles, right? The idea of the network protocol. What does that actually mean when it comes to encryption?
So many years ago, I had a discussion with one of my managers when I was on Wall Street, and he said, Colin, you seem to have figured out technology. The rest of your career will be working out how to work out people. Which actually turned out to be exactly right, and I didn't understand at the time, but I do now. Technology is actually pretty easy. People are really difficult, and that's why the internet was built around machines talking to each other. And what we really need, and what I've been working on with the rest of the folks at the ad company, is a new protocol that works the way people do. People are complicated and have nuances. And how do you get those nuances into an internet protocol? That's really the really big challenge. Well, first of all, we have an identity. We've all talked about an identity. But we all have different personas, right? So, I'm the CTO at this moment. That's my persona I'm putting on. But I also happen to be a husband. I happen to be a dad. I happen to be a Rotarian. And different people ask me different things. I give different answers. This is the same question, but I give different answers. And that's what you need to do. You need to have a protocol that can understand those nuances. So depending on who's asking, you should be able to give a different answer. And I think that's the way people work. It's not the way the technology works at the moment until we develop this protocol. But I think it's also about venues. Venues are really interesting in the human world, right? So depending on the venue, you're going to have a different type of conversation. And some of those venues are public and some of those are private. And knowing that they're public and knowing that they're private are actually very, very important, right? So democracy happens in a public space. That's not true, Gentry, is it? I mean, most of the policy actually happens in the private spaces and the lobbies. That's where the real conversations happen. And then, unless people are comfortable in those private spaces, then you don't get really good public policy. Lobbies were actually lobbies where you could have a private conversation. That was the whole point of it. So encryption gives you those private spaces on the internet to have a conversation. That could be between two people. It could be between a group of people, but it's a private space where you can be, you can speak your mind and come to a conclusion. I look forward, frankly, to having an argument, because if I'm arguing with somebody, I'm learning something, right? I'm never going to learn anything from somebody that agrees with me. That's just not possible. But you've got to have a safe space that you can have those discussions on, so you can actually learn and be vulnerable and say, yeah, I didn't think about it that way. So having everything in the open is actually really bad, because we don't actually further discussion. We don't have arguments, safe arguments. But we also have to have the public spaces. So I think that's what encryption gives us. It gives us those private spaces. And I think I get what some of the panelists are talking about around, criminals could use this stuff, and yeah, sure they could. They often speak to each other on private channels. They have their own safe space, but their behaviors are what happens in the public, and that's what you can track. And there's a difference between a public behavior and a private conversation. Otherwise, this is a 400-year-old problem at least. I'm a Brit, if you hadn't figured that out from my accent. Although I live in California and also American. I'm a British American. When coffee houses entered the UK, they were as disruptive as the internet was to the 1600s. Very, very similar sort of level of disruption. They networked the world across the British Empire, as it was, I guess, then. And there was all sorts of news runners, and frankly, the King Charles II, didn't like this at all. So he was the government and wanted to send spies into every coffee house, and that's not good, because the great thing about coffee houses was they allowed people to have private discussions and argue and further debate. So we shouldn't do that. And actually, that got kicked out pretty quickly. Nobody should shut down a coffee house. The weird thing is now, we have coffee houses where those things happen still today. So, the CEO of Starbucks is not responsible for every conversation that happens in Starbucks. Pretty sure that's true. Kevin Johnson is not responsible for every conversation that happens in Starbucks, and nor should be an encrypted venue where there's people discussing stuff. But that public behavior certainly should be policed. And I think that's where the edge is. And I'm hoping that people like Gentry can explain that stuff better than I can to our policymakers in Washington.
There's some really powerful questions coming in also. So thank you for that, Colin, because I think we're igniting a lot of food for thought, and we will get to the questions. I'm hoping that we can have some time towards the 15-minute mark as we finish the hour. But with that, Heather, I would love to hear from you around, the laying out of these conversations. At the end of the day, who holds the keys to this, and particularly in a global setting. From your point of view, what's this thing called secure encryption, and what is it really, and who holds the keys, and how does that sort of relate to what we're speaking to?
Who holds the keys in the world of decentralized identity that I work in? It's the holder. It's the individual. It's the owner, manager, controller of that data, and that data is held in a secured, verifiable credential. And so when it comes time that you want to share some information, let's take it from a human point of view. I want to share some information about myself, for instance, medical information, which is sensitive to me. I want to make sure that I can share it directly with the provider, or maybe it's a digital service that can help me with a condition that I may have, that I can share that data directly in a peer-to-peer manner and consent and control my keys by doing a peer-to-peer key exchange. So that it doesn't necessarily need to have a third party involved. I'll touch on a couple of the questions that we have gotten, and one of those is, what happens if I'm underage, death, maybe I'm not able or in a situation at that moment to manage my keys, right? And that's where the important role of guardianship is. So there has to be flexibility in who holds the keys and who, as an individual, I allow to hold the keys or manage the keys on my behalf legally, and provide them with the ability to do that, and make sure that I have the ability to revoke the exchange, to say, no, this relationship, this connection, this key exchange no longer is needed, and I can terminate that and remove my consent. So that's very important as far as who holds the keys. It's not only do I hold the keys, what control do I have over the keys, the management of the keys, and my ability to revoke those that I've shared the keys with. And that's important as we move forward in this space, as we talk about, and most of this conversation has been focused around the human. But it's also not just a human who necessarily is going to hold the keys. This can apply to businesses, institutions, organizations, things like sensors, buildings, and it can also apply to other living beings, animals, trees, plants, biology, things in the world. So as each of these entities begins being assigned and the ability to control information about themselves, they'll also control those keys. And in those cases, they'll need to provide guardianship and support to help manage those keys.
Wow. And it sounded like I was echoing. Hopefully not on your end. And Heather, if I can add a little bit more, another question for you to sort of help us expand this further. You're at Indicio and work so much on the health side of it. Would you be able to share an example of how you see this this view, the reflection that you have today, and maybe where the internet's headed, like sort of tying that point of view into this conversation, and specifically maybe the role of Indicio, what you do there with regards to health?
One of the things with the pandemic is it allowed us to make traction on how do you claim, control, and manage your health data. And the first instance in this case is with the pandemic is our COVID health status is important to share. But it's important to know that you can apply this moving forward. We also are in a situation where industries who never imagined that they would need health data from their customers, participants, They actually do. And so they were not set up before the pandemic to support the exchange of health information in a secure manner with consent. And I think the clearest example in our lives is travel and healthcare. Before the pandemic, there were not a lot of conversations on really tight-knit integrations between your airline and your healthcare provider. It just wasn't a part of our lives. So where Indicio was actually brought in the very earliest days of the pandemic is, how does the travel industry obtain health information about the traveler, but do so in a privacy-preserving, secured way with consent? And so one of the projects that Indicio supports and helps work on is with CETA, the global aviation technology provider, and in this case, the government of Aruba, is how can Aruba obtain the necessary health information about a traveler to give them pre-clearance before they even board a plane. And if you've traveled lately to another country, you'll realize there is a lot of physical printout paperwork involved in your travels. And this is not sustainable, nor does it add to the travel experience. And so what we have done in that work with Aruba is now a traveler can obtain a COVID test, and that medical record is given directly from the provider or hospital to the traveler. And once the result of that test is given, it is communicated directly to the traveler, and then the traveler can provide that source medical data, and only the data the government of Aruba needs to approve your visit to the island. And so the traveler is the one that consents and passes that credential, that medical record, to the government of Aruba. The government of Aruba has the ability to make sure that you meet the travel criteria. And then what they do is they share back to the traveler what is called a Happy Traveler card. And that Happy Traveler card is a secured, encrypted credential. And it says that you can freely move about the island. Well, that's important to enter high-risk environments for COVID, like nightclubs, like casinos, like the fun places, right? And those facilities also want to have the ability to increase the number of customers. They're no longer kept at a 30% occupancy, that they can move up to 80 or 90%. And so by accepting the approved Happy Traveler card, a tourist can show up to their favorite casino. The Happy Traveler card is scanned, but here's the key. The venue only knows that you met the requirements of the government of Aruba. They don't know how. They don't know if it's a PCR test. They don't know if you're vaccinated. They don't know. All they know is the government has approved you to move about the island. They don't know, where you're staying. They don't know your phone number. And before this, when you go to venues, you would have to physically fill out a sheet with your name, your hotel, etc., and talk about, as a single woman traveling, that's not an exciting thing to have to do repeatedly. And so what this Happy Traveler card is allowed organizations to open up the island. This work continues to move forward for the travel and aviation industry. And while this is a wonderful use case and progress for the pandemic and COVID health information, what it really does is it paves the future for the implementation in the US of the 21st Century Cures Act. And the 21st Century Cures Act requires that patients have the ability to obtain their digital medical records and that they have the ability to share it. So in this case, a person may not necessarily want to share their health record to their provider. They may want to share it with a digital health service to provide some other benefit in their healthcare. And so you can see the system that is being developed to support the travel ribbon actually can roll out and support larger regulations to empower individuals in managing their healthcare across industries, across verticals, and digital experiences.
Very well said, Heather. And it is all about across industries, and we see that such a requirement, almost like it should become table stakes at some point. Maybe it already is, to think about that from a ecosystem standpoint, and what are we actually doing across the ecosystem. I want to bring it to Gentry for a moment. I know that we're going to be at the hour very soon, so we'll get to the Q&A in a minute. Gentry, any thoughts there from your end on where the internet's headed? And I know Anova Intelligence has a lot about privacy preserving AI and ML thought process. You mentioned AI is not new. It's been there forever. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, but to keep it short, yeah, our technology is sort of like the chocolate to all of your peanut butter. The idea that a person has agency and has consent over their own data is essential for the future of the internet. And like everyone has said, the way we designed it just didn't really work out in the end, and the way it's being used now. The other half of keeping reasonable security and reasonable privacy is what we're calling right now privacy preserving AI ML, so PPAI ML. It's because it's an acronym. You know, we're in DC. We have to call it by the acronym PPAI ML. It used to be an academic endeavor, but it's a real thing right now, and this is the sort of advanced technology we use. But let me get back to your original question. The future of the internet? Oh, we don't know. Who knows? We were, Colin, I'm old like you. I lived in South Park in San Francisco in 1995. I would in the heart of it. We were not thinking about YouTube or PayPal or the best parts of the internet that we use all the time right now. Yeah, who knows? But I certainly hope that security and reasonable privacy is not a bolt-on like it's been so far. So I hope. The other thing I want to say really quick is the best technology doesn't always win. So the future of the internet and encryption really depends on who's investing in it. So,
oh my goodness,
yeah.
That's very deep actually, and it's so true. It's so true, and we have so many examples of that even in the last 4 or 5 years. But let me quickly pass it over to you, Edna. And, I know there was a question also about security by design. This sort of view on the internet and where it's headed also, but from a point of view of just utilizing these factors of privacy, security, and compliance. How do we aim for that?
So I think you have to write your own architecture, to be honest with you. I mean, I think if you're going to be committed to the goal, you actually have to commit to the goal. And for me, it's sometimes, let's be honest, in a large multinational, it's never easy to get everybody aligned around anything because of many reasons, right? We're all focused on our own priorities. I always say there's a sinful abundance of intellectual prowess where I live. Try corralling those people and it doesn't really work well. So the architecture has to be internal, but it also has to be external, right? This is what we forget. And the internet has brought us there. We live in a world of we. There's no longer us and them. It's just we. So if you start to hear what Gentry is saying and what Heather is driving at, which is in the middle of the we is still I. And there are certain things that I need to own and control, right? I think that architecture has to say, well, third-party community, I want to make sure that I am aware of what you are doing to protect me and the processes that you're using, and how can we achieve that? And it can't always be full-blown assessments or audits of everybody because nobody can afford that. Sometimes it's certifications. Sometimes it's the indicia, if you will, of approval that you could see right now. And how comfortable am I if I look at you and you say I have a SOC 2 certification and an ISO 27001 certification? I have some level of comfort. If you start to say to me, I have FISMA and FedRAMP, I get a little more comfortable, right? And that's analogous to what Heather is saying, which is I, as an individual, can say you should be comfortable with me without showing you all of the health information that I don't want you to know, just like so many of us at the enterprise level, while I'm asking invasive questions, somebody might look back at me and say, that's lovely that you'd like to know that, Edna. I'm not sharing that with you. I'm going to share this with you. So for me, there's actually an alignment between operational cadence at an enterprise and a government level and the individual level that you hear. I think we're ahead of the curve on the individual level. That's my view. I don't know if everybody agrees with me. I think it takes a little bit more time, energy, and alignment to get governments and to get enterprises to get to that point. Really difficult, right? So for me, the answer is have the architecture, know what you care about, but for Pete's sake, be flexible in what you accept as evidence of the third party achieving the goal, so that you can not only walk into the casino in Aruba, but hopefully you can actually now serve as somebody who can bring your technology and innovation into the Azure intelligent platform, because I know I can trust the way you design, the way you develop, the way you handle privacy obligations, and a whole host of other things, because I told you what I want and you showed me to some degree how you can achieve the goal.
It's very, and I would fully agree on architecture being so critical. And certainly there's so many things out there with regards to the kinds of things that our toolkits should be sitting on. And we can probably have another whole discussion about that one day. With regard to the human side, let's go back and bring it home. I think we have about 9 minutes left, and there are some really important questions to get to. But Colin, if you can share a little bit around humanized environments, we have them, let's say at some point, we have secure venues. What do we gain? What's this future going to be like?
So if you look at the way humans interact, to know whether you can trust somebody or not, the only way to do that really is two ways. How do you trust somebody? How do you know you can trust them? Well, the only way that I know you can trust somebody without somebody vouching for them is to trust them. So you have to trust people to know whether you can trust them. And some circumstances you can do that. And I think in some ways, some of the solutions we've got out at the moment, that's what you have to do, right? So if you exchange a token with somebody, how do you really know it's the other person? Well, you don't really know. So you have to sort of, you have to trust them situation. How do you get out of that problem? I think that's where this sort of these triangles of trust come in. And triangles are very strong, and we use them all the time. We don't tend to think about them. So when somebody, I know a cop pulls me over and says, "Show me your license." Who they actually trusting? They're trusting whoever gave you the license, right? That's I trust the DMV. The cop trusts the DMV. And we've got a triangle there, and it's pretty strong. But on the internet, that's sort of missing, right? So, and I think that's what Heather was talking about, where you have these mutually trusted places for different things, right? So we all trust the DMV can issue license plates, and we all have we all trust that, and that's fine. But we don't trust the DMV with their health records. We trust somebody else with that, and being accountable and anonymous at the same time is really important. That was one of the biggest challenges that Vince Cerf gave us at the very early days of the ad company. Is sometimes I want to be anonymous, but I still need to be. One of the biggest problems on the internet today is accountability, and this triangle of trust, of this mutual trust point, I think is really important. So we call those attestations, but attestations is essentially how humans work, right? So if you want to bring somebody in, you can bring into your company, you can sort of trust your gut, but it's much better if you know somebody who knows somebody, and then you bring them in, because you've reduced the risk. So what is trust? That's a really big question. There's a lady, I can't remember her second name, but I'll put in the links. But Rachel in the UK, she describes trust with as, I'm going to praise it a little bit, but being comfortable with the unknown. And I really like that. Trust is a very difficult thing to explain, but getting a little bit more comfortable with the unknown is much easier if both sides of the trust triangle have a third party that knows both of you. So that's how humans work, and that's really what we need on the internet. And that's what we've been striving to do, to provide that underlying protocol to allow that stuff sort of to happen.
It's really interesting, Colin, because as you were thinking about that, I was thinking about my actuarial thinking, and that is, being comfortable with the unknown is not really where my head went to. It was more about, what do I know? How much do I know about it? How much do I value what I know? Versus,
I think that's a mistake we've been making for 2 decades now. Is we've actually been thinking about trust the wrong way. And one of the other things that I really like that Rachel was talking about, and it really echoed to me, there's like, I'm really trustworthy because I'm transparent. That's not true. We've all been told, I think, many, many times that if you're transparent, then you're trustworthy. That's not true. Transparency is kryptonite to trust. You've eradicated trust because you don't need trust because you're transparent. And that takes a little bit of thought. And that's why, that's why I think you'll see many, many more open source projects. Because if you're going to use a bit of security or a bit of encryption, then it better be open source. Not because we don't trust you, it's because it's in the open, so trust isn't needed. You've eradicated the need for trust.
It is something you really have to think about, I guess. And thank you for that, Colin. I have a whole list of things that I wrote down as you were all for speaking, and I would love to have a take 2 of all of this so that we can go deeper on each one of these. I know Minavak, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, had a couple questions. Let me just quickly get to 1 or 2 of them as we have the 4 minutes remaining, and then I would love to just thank you all. But before that, so me had one of the questions that Edna, I think it comes to you, or we can start with you, is what are the panel's thoughts on offline versus online access? Seems to me we assume online all the time. What about off-grid during a natural disaster or a sensitive location? Hospital, critical care or unit or a government facility?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think a lot of people forget it. There's a reason why you say business continuity and disaster recovery, because business continuity when everything's going great is one level, and disaster recovery is a different level. And so the analogy I always use is, yes, you have to have both, but imagine, for example, physical security, right? So I'll always go to my happy place, which is a factory producing, of course, an information and communications technology. And you have security guards, and they provide some degree of physical security. And there's a flood. You might postulate where this happened. This might actually be an example I've lived through. And when you look at somebody and say, do you have a business continuity plan? They're like, yep. Absolutely. Here's my plan. It's this long, and here's everything we do, and then we test it, and that's fabulous. So the flood happens, and you just out of curiosity, where are the security guards? Because I know where I'd be in a flood. I'd be home sandbagging my house and taking care of my family. I would not be at the factory. So what's your backup plan for that, right? And so I think it's this concept of injecting not just identity, but continuity of the protection levels that encryption and other techniques, both physical and digital, afford us in all circumstances, because they can't work everywhere, right? And so you go back to what Heather said, you don't want to have paper, but what happens when all, heck breaks loose and there's no power and your digital devices are gone? And you're trying to get into somewhere and they're trying to protect what they have and you can't figure it out, right? And I've actually seen this in a very small environment outside of the US where they had a similar disaster, and they were actually very digitally advanced, this community. They wouldn't let people into the supermarkets to get food because they didn't have digital access capabilities. And they didn't have digital access capabilities, not because they weren't trusted, not because they didn't have immutable identity that they controlled, but because they couldn't show you the evidence of it digitally.
Very well said. I had one more question I was going to run by, but we do only have 1 minute left. So for those of you whose questions, I think there were several of folks that were very active on the question side. If there's any question that we really would like answered by this panel, please email them to Denise at @atsign.com, and we will try our best to triage them to the right folks and then provide back the answer for you. I want to thank you all very much. It was remarkable. You are superhumans and doing things that we as a human race really need. We rely heavily on the internet. We rely heavily on you doing your best of work so that we can be out of mind in fear and concern. So I think a lot of the questions are relating to that as well. So I'm hoping that we can meet with you again and have a deeper dive another time. But this was wonderful. I hope everyone got some really wonderful food for thought.
Yeah, thank you. And what a great panel of real deep technologists and not just spokespeople. This was wonderful.
And
Thanks
I
so much,
really
Henna.
appreciate your outside in thinking. You didn't hold anything back, which was awesome. Edna, Colin, Heather.
It was a privilege. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.